Today on CityCast DC, no member of the DC Council has ever been recalled, but there is a group of Capitol Hill residents who want to change that. They are out to get the Ward 6 Councilmember Charles Allen, who they blame for last year's spike in crime. Bridget and I talked with Rich Masters, one of the campaign's organizers. We wanted to hear his case against Allen. And by the way, we're going to be talking to Allen tomorrow. Today is Monday, May 20th. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC is talking about.
So, Rich, you're part of a campaign to recall Ward 6 Councilmember Charles Allen. I guess my first question is, why?
That's a great question, and we get it all the time. I get it from our neighbors and friends. And the idea for the recall came about. A bunch of us folks who are friends, in Ward 6 that actually live on Capitol Hill, our kids all went to school together. We're talking a lot about the crime issues that we had seen in the district. I think a week before, the neighbor across the street used to be a staffer for Dick Durbin. She was carjacked at gunpoint right across the street from my house. Within about 2 months, there was 4 different carjackings on our block. And all of us lived in different parts of Ward 6. I mean, I moved to Ward 6, in 1996. And so we've been here almost 30 years. And we talked about the changes that have gone on in the district. And I think one of the conclusions that we came to is that a lot of the policies that have been enacted by the DC City Council have not been necessarily helpful. I think all of us had voted for Charles Allen. Some of us had given him money. And by and large, we liked what he was doing. But when we really kind of rolled up our sleeves and started looking at it, I think some of the policies that were lenient toward criminals and, fighting to defund the police, I think were troubling to us. We didn't see the city council, the mayor, or anyone really taking this crime issue seriously. And so since he was the chair of the Crime and Criminal Justice Committee for years when some of these policies were enacted, and more importantly, he was our city councilman, we decided that we would mount this effort. First of all, to recall him. Secondly, more importantly, even if we don't get the recall, the fact that we make enough noise is part of what democracy is all about. And you've seen, I think we've already kind of been successful. I think the DC Secure Bill passed, which rolled back some of the policies that he had championed, and he voted for those. So I think our voices are being heard at the end of the day. So we really want to recall him. We've had thousands of signatures already. Whether we're able to get there or not remains to be seen. It should be a high bar to recall your councilman. Recalling him, I think, would send a loud signal both to him and to the rest of the city council and the city leadership that they need to take crime more seriously. They're already starting to take crime more seriously, and I think our movement has had a little bit to do with that.
All right, but look, there's a lot of places that made similar changes in 2020 as part of the national trend. And a lot of those places didn't see crime do what it did in DC. So I'm having a hard time seeing how Charles Allen in particular, or those bills in particular, can be singled out. And how is it that you come to blame those things for the rise in crime that could just as easily have had to do with the backlash of the pandemic and so on?
Well, it could, Michael. And if you look, there are other cities, San Francisco and Chicago, both of which passed similar policies. They're also rolling back some of those policies. So I'm not a criminal justice expert. Don't pretend to be. I'm a dad who wants my daughter, when she graduates from college, to move back to DC, and I want grandkids in DC. That's our home. And so I firmly believe that crime is a very complex issue for sure. And no one or two things is going to be able to really cure that. But I do think that having an extra focus on it and really talking about it, I think, is really important. My sense is, policies that allow someone to be 24 years old to be treated as a juvenile, which is something that he has championed, I don't think is wise. I don't think it's doing anything really to help us. I realized there was a lot of people after the protest. I mean, I marched with my daughter and my family 3 different times. And so I think that the policies come from a good place. I've said at the beginning, we don't disagree with his heart. We disagree with his head. I think the evidence is clear that there is a rise in crime, and a lot of us followed these policies. So, Michael, I think that's where we've come down. But I think that myself and the group that has led this effort are just, tired. They've had enough. Enough is enough, and we want to make our voices heard about it.
I'm curious, what are some of the specific policies that you attribute to Allen that you say have led to this, not just rise in crime, but this feeling of leniency toward people who commit crimes in D.C.?
Well, I mean, I think there's a couple instances. The second look provisions that were passed, and then they were actually expanded from there. I touched on one of the policies about upping the rates to be considered a juvenile from 18 to 24. So up until your 25th birthday, you can commit a crime and be treated from the criminal justice perspective as if you're a juvenile. That's lenient on crime. I understand there's a body of evidence that brains aren't fully developed till they're 25. I get kind of that compassion, but I think, that and then reducing the sentencing. You saw Charles Allen lead a fight to reduce carjackings penalties that was so extreme that even Mayor Bowser and Biden said that's something we, have to reject. And so I think that there's been several policies like that. I think gutting the police department and, taking.
But what do you mean gutting? Like, what's the, how do we?
Taking the police department and eliminating, $15 million. Today, Michael, we have 500 fewer police officers on the street. And that is directly attributable to the actions of the city council led by Charles.
But look at it. There's another way of looking at it too, which is that the police department budget is around $600 million, $578 million, I believe was the recommendation a couple of years ago. 15 million is a pretty small percentage of that. And we're at a time when every profession is having staffing crises, again, after the pandemic. So I feel like that, maybe I'm harping on the vocabulary of gutted, but that seems like not an accurate description of what's happened. That's not to say the police department hasn't had staffing problems or there haven't been like real debates that Allen's side mostly prevailed on to shrink instead of grow. But like this idea that this is this giving up policing, that seems not accurate.
Well, it is accurate that we have 500 fewer police officers today than we did before. And you are right. There's a lot of different type of staffing issues that you have, but there is no doubt that we have 500 fewer police officers on the street. And, a lot of that has to do with the policies that were enacted. It doesn't take a genius to figure out if you have more criminals on the street with fewer police officers, there could be an increase in crime. And I think that's what we're saying. And if you look throughout all that debate, Charles continually said, our strategy is to turn the spigot off to the police department. So whether it's $15 million, whether it's $50 million, his theory, his strategy, and this is his words, not mine, is to cut off the spigot for the police department. Well, that sends a signal, I think, that we don't support the police department. Now, you've seen him and others kind of change their tune over the course of the last 6 months to a year, and we applaud him for that. We applaud the D.C. Secure Bill. It didn't go far enough, I think, a lot of our opinions. But nonetheless, I think that was something that was, a step in the right direction. And I think some of it had to do with the fact that a group of us have said enough is enough.
I'm curious because I know that Bowser also proposed cuts to MPD's budget that year. Why not go after her?
Let's just talk about real politics. Doing a recall is very, very difficult. And by the way, it should be difficult. For instance, in order to recall Charles Allen, we have to get 6,500 some signatures. That's a lot. And we'll probably have to get in the neighborhood of 10 to 12,000 just to make sure that they're all verified, right? And we're verifying as we go along. If we were to do it against Mayor Bowser, it'd be the bar is significantly higher. We want to have impact on crime, and the recall, while we hope it succeeds, if it doesn't succeed, I think we've at least succeeded in raising the awareness. And so the bar is lower, and more importantly, he's our councilman. I mean, he's where we live, and we're a group of political consultants. We're all Democratic kind of political consultants who worked on political campaigns, throughout our entire careers. And it was something that we thought we needed to do. And I think we're all at an age where our kids who all grew up in the district have all gone on to college. And some of the kids don't come back. They're like, we have no interest in coming back to DC. I want my kids to come back here. I want to have my grandkids come back here. And I think that's kind of where our hearts are on this and why we decided to do what we did.
Is crime why they're not coming back? Or is it they want to live someplace cool? I mean, you know what it's like.
Well, true. I mean, the city's gotten to be more of a foodie city, which is definitely a thing. I think crime is a big factor. I mean, my daughter is in New York right now, going to Fordham, and crime here is just as bad, right? But she's like, I'm going to go to New York and back to DC. So hopefully she's going to come back to DC. And I think she will.
So look, here's some of the pushback from supporters of the incumbent, Charles Allen, which is that when I wrote my political column on the recall effort, the folks I spoke to, most of you from national politics, most of you Democrats, but there's a lot of Republican money in this. And two, it sort of fuels this Republican agenda of paint the blue cities as dangerous and poorly run in a kind of hysterical way. How do you respond to that?
Well, if I were running Charles's campaign, I'd want to run against Donald Trump, too. It's a whole lot easier if you're in Washington, D.C., in an area which is 80% Democrats. It's a whole lot easier to paint us as kind of extremists that are supporting a MAGA kind of point of view to try to demonize us. The truth is, the leaders behind this movement are all Democrats. You reported it. There is no doubt that there are Republicans who support what we're trying to do. There's no doubt that there are Republicans who have contributed to the campaign. But just look at what happened yesterday, Michael, with the DC crime bill that Congress put out. We rejected that because of the fact that we're Democrats. We don't need Republicans in Congress. And even though 18 Democrats voted for it as well, by the way, we don't need Congress sticking their nose into district politics. We disagree with what Congress did. We agree that the sentencing guidelines should be tougher. We agree with some of the things that were said in that bill, but it should be up to DC. That's what this recall is all about. And that's one of the irritating things about some of the pushback we're hearing, Michael, is that we're anti-home rule. What could be more home rule than a group of local citizens trying to recall their councilman? I hear the pushback. I hear it all the time. We're not going to run away from the fact that, there are Republicans who have contributed. There are Republicans who have signs up in their front yard. But this is an effort led by a group of Democrats who just fundamentally disagree with some of the policies that Charles has advocated over the last couple of years.
It seems to me there's a little bit of the split in the Democratic Party in D.C.
There is.
And even you cited, earlier you said, even President Biden and Mayor Bowser pushed back against it, which indicates to me that this is sort of another D.C. progressives versus centrists.
I think that's a fair characterization. I think you're seeing it happen in the party writ large. I mean, 18 Democrats joined to vote for the Byron Donald bill. 18. And so you see that there's this split, I think, of the Democratic Party really writ large across the divide. It's, you have kind of the far left and you have centrists. And I think the Democratic Party itself is going to have to come to terms with how do we disagree with one another when we agree on 90% of just about everything else? How can we disagree on policy without kind of going in each other's throats? And that's what we're trying to do with this.
But isn't trying to recall somebody who won with 90% of the vote 2 years ago after a lot of the bills in question got passed, isn't that kind of being at someone's throat?
None of us say that he's a bad person or he's a bad guy. He's not, but he's wrong on this policy. And I think this is more about trying to make a statement. And again, I think going back to your original point, Michael, there is a split in the Democratic Party over some of these issues of crime and criminal justice. And I think we, as Democrats, we need to argue respectfully with one another. We've certainly tried to be respectful to him. We just want him to look at his views, and he's starting to. I mean, truancy, the level of truancy is the lead indicator of criminal activity. And Charles Allen's never said a thing about truancy until the last couple months, where he's kind of tried to talk about it. So I think we're having a positive impact, whether or not we recall him or not. I mean, and again, our goal still is to recall him. But if we don't, we've still made an impact. And I think a lot of people don't pay attention to the city races. I know I'll plead guilty to, I kind of just trusted Democrats and just voted Democrats down the line and didn't pay a whole lot of attention to it. And so I think that at the very least, he's going to hear from his constituents. He's never really had a race. I mean, Tommy Wells handed him the seat and he just kind of runs and is reelected. And so he's finally hearing from other voices in Ward 6. At the end of the day, that's democracy. And I think that's a good thing.
So some of your opponents, neighbors for Ward 6, say that some of the recall campaign's talking points are misleading and disingenuous. One of the examples they cite is that they rebuke claims that Allen's policies have led to a shortage of police, and they cite national trends and MPD's own data showing that more officers actually voluntarily left or retired in 2015 and 2016 than those who left after 2020. They also claim that there's no evidence that the passage of these reforms like banning chokeholds and creating transparency when officers commit serious crimes like domestic violence, have resulted in an inability to hire more officers. So they're basically saying they're playing fast and loose with these claims. We push back on these talking points. The talking points are very misleading. What do you have to say about this?
I disagree with them, obviously. I mean, I think that there are a number of reasons why police officers choose not to come to work in a city. I think that, D.C. in particular is a tough place. I mean, look what happened on January 6th. We had a lot of good officers that were thrown into the churn about what's going on there. And I think there's a lot of reasons why police officers choose maybe not to come to D.C. I was in New York, again, for my daughter's graduation. And on the subway, there's great big signs, please come to D.C. and be a police officer, with massive promises of a lot of things. So I know they're out heavily recruiting to get police officers here. But I think there's no doubt that when you have a city council who say we're going to turn the spigot up and have embraced defunding the police, if you are someone who wants to go to a place and be a police officer, when you hear the city council repeatedly talk about defunding the police and how awful the police are, why would you go there? And so there's really no hard evidence one way or the other. We have a point of view. Obviously, Charles has a point of view. And, I think that the evidence is clear. We're down 500 police officers, and there's no doubt, I don't believe that some of his policies and the policies that the city council passed have had a hand in that. Are they so-called? No, but they've had a hand in it. And as a democracy, we're trying to raise our voices and say, you need to pay attention to this.
But wait, can I drill in on a couple of these alleged constraints on police, like leaving aside the budget and the numbers?
Yeah.
They banned chokeholds. Are you pro chokehold?
No. There are certain parts of the Police Reform Act that we support, right? I mean, none of us want to roll back and go back to arresting kids on the street for having a dime bag and throwing them in jail for 20 years. No one wants to go back to stop and frisk at all. We reject all of that. And it's easy to say that that's what we want to do. We don't want to do that. Now, don't get me wrong. There'll be people that will vote for the recall that probably do. We want to have a dialogue about how we go about this reform. And the question is, have we gone too far, right? I mean, I think that's the overall question, because none of us want to go back to the bad old days, and none of us want to go back to, endless incarceration for minor crimes. But you don't overcompensate that by just eliminating penalties for carjackings, not eliminating, but lowering them. And I think that's where we're at, Michael. So there are pieces of it that we support, and we don't think that that's the sole reason. I think the rhetoric, to be quite honest, if I'm going to go to a city, I'm going to look at what the city council says about the police officers. And if you look at some of Charles Allen's tweets, and not just him, again, the whole city council, he's our councilman, they appear openly hostile to the police. And I think that sends a loud signal. And I think it's had a role. Is it the sole reason? No, it's not. But I think it has played a role in where we are with the police department.
Is there anything that Allen could say or do to get your vote back or to stop the campaign?
Sure. I didn't personally reach out to him. I know other people in our committee did. Moses Mercado, who is a Democratic field organizer, worked for Richard Gephardt and was an Obama superdelegate, helped lead field for President Obama, reached out to him several times, no calls back. I think when it first came out, had he not jumped immediately into charging that we are MAGA extremists, that we're outsiders who have never lived here. I mean, he went into open attack mode. I think at the very beginning of this, he could have said, listen, let's talk about this. Let's figure it out. Because he did change his mind. He did vote for DC Secure, which rolled back some of those things that he had once advocated for. I think if he was just honest and said, listen, I did what I thought was best at the time in the wake of the George Floyd protests. I did what I thought was right. Clearly, we went too far. And so let's start rolling some of this back. But he won't do that. And I think that that's been the biggest challenge. So, yeah, I think voting for DC Secure Bill was a good step in the right direction for us. It didn't go far enough, I don't think. And again, it goes back to that leniency for criminals. And it comes from a good place. I think, there's a fine balance, I think, that we need to strike. And so, Bridget, I think if you would reach out and say, let's talk, I hear you, but he hasn't done that. Instead, they've gone on the attack and trying to say that somehow we're outsiders, and because we work in national politics, that somehow we're a bunch of fools and that MAGA is using us. I think had he just reached out and said, hey, let's talk about this. I understand there's a split in the Democratic Party between the far left and more centrist Democrats. Let's have a discussion. But instead, he attacked us and treated us like we were MAGA extremists and that haven't lived in the district. I moved to the district when he was in high school in Alabama. So for him to say that we're some kind of outsider, it just is kind of infuriating, Bridget.
Hey, let me ask just a practical question before we let you go. Hey, there's never been a successful recall of a DC council member. Under the law, if you do successfully recall him, there will be an election for his replacement. Now, keep in mind, Charles ran unopposed. He got 96% of the vote 2 years ago. So if you guys succeed, do you have a candidate in mind for the special election?
No, and that's one of the things early on, talk, Michael, about, should we have a kind of a candidate in mind? And none of us really did. None of us had a single person in mind. And more importantly, Michael, I think one of the things that we want to do is if we're successful and we do recall him, Charles can run for that seat again. So if he decides he wants to put himself through that after being recalled.
Would you vote for him?
I might. I might, Michael. I mean, if we're able to recall him, regardless of who the name is that is recalled, they will have heard from their constituents that enough is enough. Stop the lenient on criminal, tough on police policies. And again, that's a generalization, right? But that's where we are. Whoever the next council person will be will win with the knowledge that people in his district or her district disagree with those type policies. So the person is really irrelevant. There are one of the things, honestly, that has been really nice to see from my standpoint, as someone who admittedly has not spent a lot of time at all with looking at DC politics, is the amount of bright young people that we have in this district. We've got a lot of young people who are out, working, on this for us. Maybe one of them, I don't know. So we just don't have a candidate because at the end of the day, this is not about anyone, including Charles. This is about telling our leaders, let's get serious about it. I think we've drawn a spotlight to this issue, and we want to move it forward in a constructive way, as opposed to just screaming and yelling and let's let Congress come in and do this. Congress needs to butt out. Republicans in Congress don't need to do anything in the district. We got this. And that's what this recall is all about. I mean, that's why when I hear Tommy Wells say this is anti-home rule, it makes my blood boil. It's just ridiculous. What could be more home rule than a bunch of citizens trying to recall their council person?
Hey, Rich, thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Bridget. I really appreciate the opportunity to come in here and talk.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you all.
That's all for today here on CityCast DC. Again, we're going to be talking with Charles Allen tomorrow, getting some of the other side of the story. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.